Hey, my name is Alexei. I'm one of the two co-founders of Intelay. We come from academia, from like the academic world. We've been doing research on cross-chain bridges for the last 5 years or so. And the talk today is about, well, mastering them. So I'll not really go into much detail on why we need bridges. It's pretty obvious, right? There won't be one coin or one chain to rule them all. Scaling, different applications, right? We see the app chain thesis developing. And there will be more than one system, and we will have to bridge between them. But if we look at bridges today, and last week I measured, right, we had, in the last 30 days, we had over $10 billion moved between different chains. And less than 10% of this volume was actually decentralized, and that's only thanks to some app chain kind of networks like Polkadot, Cosmos, L2 bridges, and also the Intelay Bitcoin bridge sneaking in there. But that's about it, right? Most other bridges are centralized today. And that's an issue. Now, let's dive into cross-chain bridges 101 and really go into the basics, look at it from first principles. Now, the first thing to really kind of try to get into your mind is that to bridge means to deposit. And it might not be super intuitive because I know like a lot of teams and projects really tend to over-engineer it. They throw buzzwords at you like and everything. But in the end, you're just depositing into a system. And that system might be decentralized, but it doesn't have to be. So by depositing onto Arbitrum, Optimism, or into Polkadot, Intelay, Binance Chain, Avalanche is basically very similar to just depositing into Binance or Kraken, or into some custodial wallets. So you want to use the product, the system, and whether it's decentralized or not, you put your assets there. And the goals when bridging are, again, very similar to depositing into a decentralized or centralized exchange, right? We deposit ETH into an app chain, and again, app chain can be L2, Parrot chain, Cosmos, Tendermint, SDK chain, doesn't matter. You use ETH there like a native asset, right? You don't want to worry about converting whatever. It should be, when you put your money onto an exchange, you don't have to figure out, is it really compatible with other trading pairs? And then you withdraw back to Ethereum. And what you want to have is a UX as simple as on centralized platforms. You don't want to deal with, changing network in your wallet and figuring out like, oh, how does the routing work and clicking 5 times to the UI. And you also always want to get your ETH back, pretty clear. Now, before we dive into some more details, let's remember trust models, right? If we're still in a single chain, what we're using and what we need is a wallet. We trust that the network is secure. We hope that the wallet is not corrupted, and we verify this by looking at the open source code of the community and so on. Now, if we go multi-chain, and let's say we're using 2 chains, suddenly we have potentially 2 wallets. In some cases, we might be able to use MetaMask or like different multi-chain wallets, but in the end, you're actually still managing 2 accounts now, even if that thing absorbs and hides it for you. And you need a way to bridge. And what you trust is, well, you're implicitly trusting that network 1, let's say Ethereum, and let's say you're going to Polkadot. Trust that Ethereum and Polkadot are both secure. Otherwise, you wouldn't be bridging over, right? If you don't think that the target system is secure, you shouldn't be putting your assets there. And then you trust that the wallets are not corrupted, and that's the most important one, that the bridge is not corrupted. And typically, and very often, the bridge is the weakest link. Now, wrapping, and again, most of you already heard this probably, but bear with me, right? Ethereum exists only on the Ethereum main chain, right? Just by design, blockchains don't, you can't really just pick out an asset and move it somewhere else. It exists because, well, it's in the databases of the nodes. Now, so to bridge over, what you need to do is you need to wrap it. So you create a one-to-one representation on another chain, like a clone or like a projection. And that thing you can then use. Now, obviously, what you don't want is your Ethereum being moved away from the Ethereum chain to somewhere else while you're using the projection on the other side. So from computer science terms, what you're trying to do is you're obtaining a write lock, right? You don't want this Ethereum coin or whatever you're moving over to be able to change state. So it should not be able to, like nobody should be able to claim it while the wrapped Ethereum is used on the other side. And then what you also want to do is you want to apply all the updates that were made to this token on Polkadot. So let's say if I transfer ownership of this wrapped ETH to somebody else, it should not be me who can claim the original Ethereum asset, but the new owner. Right, so far so clear, pretty standard stuff. So why is it so difficult to actually build bridges? And this actually leads us back to the fair exchange problem. And this might sound very weird, so like why are we talking about exchanging stuff now? But this is one of the oldest problems we have in commerce, and it also applies to bridges. Now, fair exchange, very clear. Alice wants the apple, Bob wants some coins, right? In this case, BTC. How do they exchange? Back in the days, they would meet in a market, public place, usually where there's guards, so, Bob can't, steal the money from Alice. But on the internet, well, who are you going to trust, right? Somebody has to go first. Like if you're thinking of ordering stuff from Amazon, either you pay up front or the merchant trusts that you will pay at some point later. And if you have a system like we have on Ethereum or other decentralized networks, entities are pseudonymous. You don't know who that person is. And then you need a trusted third party if you want to achieve fairness in 100% of the cases. That's a very, very old proof from 1999 for those of you who are interested in academic paper reading. But TLDR, if you want to swap or exchange assets between two people, you need a trusted third party, or both of them need to be online the whole time and kind of react in a timely manner, which is basically equivalent, because then you become your own kind of, you trust that I won't, I trust myself that I won't go offline if you're using like H2C swaps with time locks, mainly used on Bitcoin. But in the end, trusted third party is unfortunately what we need. Now, how does this relate to bridges? Wrapping is actually swapping ETH for wrapped ETH. And unwrapping is you swap wrapped ETH for ETH. And in the end, someone needs to make sure that the locking and unlocking works correctly. Now, we're on Ethereum, right? We know, we can use smart contracts. And that is true. But it's not always that simple, because someone needs to still coordinate the synchronization between these contracts, right? So if Alice wants to mint some pink ETH on Polkadot, right? She locks the Ethereum, and Bob, obviously, who might be the recipient of the Ethereum on Polkadot, then wants to make sure that the ETH is actually locked. And we need to synchronize these things. And the way to do this is, well, picking a suitable custodian or centralized party to coordinate. And obviously, the simplest one is using a centralized entity, right? So you deposit. So think of if you're going from, using Binance, for example. You deposit into Binance, let's say USDT from Ethereum, and then you withdraw it to Tron, right? You're using Binance as your centralized bridging entity. You trust them. Now, the better option would be to use a committee, right? So instead of trusting one person or one kind of entity, you have a multisig. And that's what most bridges use today, right? So I'm not going to name names, but essentially most of the bridges that we have are multisigs. And they may call it differently, but that's what it is. Now, then you can take a step further and say, well, we don't want a static multisig. We want to allow other people to join. We want to make it more dynamic, inclusive, more open. And that's where you go into the direction of using a third decentralized network. So let's say you have Polkadot, you have Ethereum, and then you use another decentralized network that it kind of, where people do proof of stake, and they kind of, their main role is to run nodes on Ethereum and Polkadot and make sure that the wrapping and unwrapping works correctly. But again, you're trusting a third network, you're introducing a new trust assumption. So the optimal case would obviously only be to trust Ethereum and Polkadot, nobody else. And we'll get to that in a second. So reminder, most centralized bridges, how do they work? You deposit ETH into the custodian's account on one side. That person or thing confirms to the target chain, right? Oh yeah, I got the assets. Let's mint some wrapped ETH. And there you go, you got it. Simple. If you want to go back, you have to ask them to actually give it back to you. And if they don't, right, well, there's nothing you can do. And we've seen so many bridge hacks happen over the past years, not even necessarily because people are bad, but where, if you're trying to build a decentralized system and you're using DeFi, is it really DeFi if the bridges that you're using are CeFi, right? And we've had just a few examples of recent exploits that were due to private key and access control issues, right? We're not speaking about Nomad and issues of bridges that had just exploits on the code and logic level. In this case, people just lost access to private keys or were compromised. So that's clear centralization risk. Or you might lose access to the keys and the system gets shut down. So generally centralization introduces risks, and in a decentralized network like Ethereum and L2s and other chains, we actually don't want that we use these systems to avoid centralization. So the question is, how do we build a decentralized bridge? And the way to do this is to try to use consensus of the chains that are involved, and then to try to inherit the decentralization and security properties of the two networks that you're interacting with. So how this could work in practice is that Ethereum would verify the Polkadot state, right? Would run like a light client version, and it would verify state changes on Polkadot and know, oh, look, somebody locked assets on Polkadot, great. Now we can unlock on Ethereum, and we mint like a wrapped asset. And vice versa. Polkadot would run a like client for Ethereum and know, oh look, Alexei has locked some assets on ETH on Ethereum, let's mint some wrapped Ether onto Polkadot, and we really know because we could cryptographically verify that. And the only thing you need then, the only party you trust, apart from the correctness of smart contracts, is one honest online node. Somebody needs to send the proofs back and forth and keep these things up to date. And this design is called light client bridges. And funny enough, we've known how to do this even earlier, but 2014 was the first time it was put into writing, and it comes from Bitcoin, right? So we've really known how to do these things for a long, long, long time. So how does it work in practice, right? So instead of having a trusted third party, you have these smart contracts here, right? And I lock ETH with this contract, and then someone relays the proof that I've locked my Ether on Ethereum to the contract, right, to the light client contract on Polkadot, and that thing mints the wrapped Ether to me. And vice versa, when I go back, I return the wrapped Ether, someone relays the proof, and then I get the Ether back. Now, what happens if this person is actually malicious and does not relay the proofs and tries to attack the system? Well, doesn't matter, because I can relay my own proofs. I can basically become one of the relayers. And if you're an application that's using these type of light client bridge systems, it makes a lot of sense to run the relayers yourself, obviously, because then you don't need to rely on other people and you get these kind of relayer networks. Something fishy is going on there. Right, now, how do you actually verify, I'll stop moving, how do you verify cross-chain state? You use things called light clients or chain relays. All right. So what this thing does, it tracks block headers. So the Ethereum chain relay light client for Polkadot will track the Polkadot block headers and metadata, so it can actually check, okay, there's a chain. It can verify and validate that, oh yes, if given two chains, I know which one will have the most stake or most proof of work behind it. And then I can verify that certain transactions were included in blocks without downloading all transactional data. Depends on the blockchain implementation, but usually there's some vector commitment scheme like Merkle trees, and you can just submit a few hashes that you can then reconstruct, and then you know, oh, this transaction was in block 5,222,000, whatever. Security model, very interesting, and it's the same as what you run on your phone when you use wallets, right? If it's in the main chain, then it must be valid because, well, the nodes in the network validated it. So if it's in the longest chain that I've seen, and I assume that I've seen, the longest chain that there is, then it must be valid if it's actually made it into that. And the only thing we need is, well, someone needs to keep that thing up to date. When you have a wallet and you will run a light client, your wallet will query data from full nodes. In this case, it's vice versa. It's a push mechanic. You have full nodes pushing data to this light client smart contract, and somebody needs to maintain that. And that's it. We've built a decentralized bridge. Now, we're short on time, so let's quickly talk about economic security in bridges, because that is also a very important concept. Let's say we have two networks, green and gray, right? And the green network has bridged some assets over to the gray one, and gray is bridging assets over to green. And if that's the market caps and economic value in the systems, this looks fine, right? Green is worth much more, it has a few assets from the gray system, nothing at risk. But if we get to something like that, where suddenly, let's say the market cap, the proof-of-stake security budget of chain B is actually smaller than what the assets are in that system, well, that's when things might get fishy. And this is, again, in theory, right? It's theoretical. We've not seen this in practice yet. Well, there have been attacks on merge mined coins on Bitcoin in the early days. But theoretically, this can and most likely will happen at some point where, if you have so many assets moved like to a smaller chain, and then somebody manages to corrupt the validators, they might really have incentive just to steal. And in that case, if the green value is USDT or some stable coin, and that's not related to the native asset, it's a pretty fair exchange. So definitely worth keeping an eye on that. Now, before we kind of wrap up, I'm not sure we'll have time to talk about Bitcoin bridges, but economic security plays a role in situations where we don't have light clients on both ends, right? Now, obviously, thinking of Bitcoin, high demand on Ethereum and in DeFi, multiple billions of dollars being moved over, all centralized. So why is that? Well, because Bitcoin, light client is possible on Polkadot, on Ethereum, right? No problem, we can actually do that. But Ethereum light client on Bitcoin is not possible. Why? Well, Bitcoin has no smart contracts. Bitcoin has no way to encode or react to external events. Just doesn't support that functionality. So someone or something or a group of people need to actually be the ones who lock and unlock on BTC. So they need to mimic and replicate the functionality that you would encode on Ethereum in a smart contract. Now, how do we do that, right? So you can go the WBTC model where you have BitGo in the middle and you trust them. But that's not so great because we have to trust one centralized entity. And to be fair, BitGo works, like WBTC has been working without any issues for so long. It's like probably still quite robust. But you never know. So what do you do? Well, the first thing is you decentralize, right? So what you can do, and this is an example on something that we built, so you would decentralize. You would allow anyone to become a so-called vault. So instead of one BitGo, you can have hundreds, thousands of people. Anyone in this room could become a bridge operator. But is that better now? Because if I'm not going to just send you Bitcoin and hope that you return it to me at some point, right? I don't know you. It's an anonymous system. So without anything else, it doesn't work. So what we add on top is incentives and punishment. All of these nodes, each one of you would have to lock up collateral in a basket of different assets. So you deposit collateral, someone deposits BTC, collateral is locked up. And what the system makes sure is that the collateral value is always more than the BTC that individual operators can get. It uses over-collateralization, liquidations, and probably most of you can recognize, it's very similar to multi-collateral stablecoins, right? Very similar liquidation mechanisms, use a basket of different assets, and as long as this thing is worth more, these nodes have no incentive to steal, because if they do, as we can see in picture 3b, if the user wants to go back and returns the wrapped Bitcoin, and these guys don't return the BTC on time, well, the user gets reimbursed and claims the collateral, and can then go and buy back Bitcoin on an exchange. And here again, we use light clients, so in these steps, when the user mints wrapped BTC, the user would submit the proof to this network that, hey, I've actually made the transaction, deposited BTC into that kind of one of these or multiple vaults, and vice versa. When the vaults need to return Bitcoin to the user, they have to prove to the system that they actually did that. So not fraud proofs. Of course, you can try to work with fraud proofs, but generally this system is guilty until you prove you're honest, right? So you actually have to proactively prove that you've returned the assets, otherwise the user gets liquidated. Of course, it's generally difficult to make proofs of non-inclusion. It's easier to prove that I've done something than for the user to prove, oh, he didn't send me money. So, outlook. And I'll skip over this because we need to leave some time for questions. In general, there will be chaos. So not a very good outlook. There's so many bridges.
Actually, you only have those 2 minutes, including questions, okay?
Yeah.
So that's
10 seconds. So problem number one, fragmentation of liquidity. There's so many different bridges. Most of them only support EVM chains. You have a lot of app chains coming online. Chains connect to EVM bridges and native bridges, and you have 5 different versions of the same asset. So you either just decide as an app chain, do I put my all eggs in one basket and I trust one bridge, but if that breaks, I'm gone. Or I diversify, but then it's all fragmented. Litecoin bridges sounds great. I've been pitching this the whole talk, but it's very difficult to build those. Bitcoin light clients work. Litecoin proof of work, not so much. Ethereum, we've seen, has some issues, but kind of works. Solana and so on are still kind of in progress. And last message before we wrap up, ZK does not solve this problem, right? If you cannot do this without ZK compression, you can do it in ZK, right? You need to write like a circuit for each of these things, so it doesn't really accelerate it that much. It makes it cheaper, but you still need to develop it, and that's the biggest bottleneck. But we firmly believe, and my personal bet is in 5 years, we will have Litecoin bridges between all major chains, simply because we know how to do it. It's a purely technical problem. And with this, thanks so much, and happy to take questions if we have time.
Hi, yeah. How would you compare this to like the UMA optimistic oracles and across that was built on top of UMA?
I mean, I'm honestly not super familiar, but in general, it doesn't really, like, if you use oracles and optimistic, right? And I'm not super familiar with UMA's design model, but guessing from the description, optimistic means you expect fraud proofs, so you assume it works, and then somebody can put in a fraud proof, I guess. that can work, right? But you still trust someone, so you trust the oracle. Someone needs to prove. If you're okay, then maybe we can take it offline. I don't want to say something wrong. I'm not that familiar with the protocol. There's a question back there.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question would be, when we're talking about light bridges, are we talking about just verifying proof of work / proof of stake? We're not talking about validating the validity rules themselves. So there is a 51% attack on that chain. I don't know that. I checked the proof of work, but the miners were corrupt. Is it possible?
So you mean, so like, you can of course try to validate the entire validity of the system, right? There's a lot of work in that direction, but you don't have to, right? And that's why we had this assumption of, like client model, if it's in the main chain, it should be valid. Of course, you don't have to have it, but that's an extension, right? So you can try to validate the entire state. It is expensive, so it's a trade-off. But then we assume that you trust the two chains anyway, right? So if you don't trust them, that's a different question. Very good point. All right, I think we're out of
Great.
time.
Thank you so much, Alexei. Always love your talks.
Thanks.